The wheel of my bike was still spinning on the asphalt when he grabbed me by the neck and slammed the van door shut. In less than 10 seconds, my childhood was over, and nobody saw. This happens on an ordinary street, on an ordinary morning, to an ordinary girl. And that's exactly why it could happen again, to any child, anywhere. In today's video, you're going to get to know my story a little better. I'm Sabine Dardenne, a 12-year-old just like any other. I lived with my parents in a quiet town in Belgium, took the same bike route to school every day, and believed the biggest dangers in the world were difficult tests or mean classmates. Nobody suspected that on that morning of May 28, 1996, I would be swallowed by the kind of evil no child should ever know. But before I continue to tell you my real survivor story, write in the comments where you're watching this from. I like to see how far my story reaches, and please subscribe to the channel. My story is real, it's unfiltered, and it might help other women who are living today what I lived through. I was kidnapped on my way to school by a man the state already knew about, someone who should never have been walking free, Marc Dutroux, and this is how it all happened. It was a Monday morning like any other, and I was heading to school. No letter, no warning, just emptiness. I vanished between one pedal stroke and the next corner, like the ground had swallowed my existence whole. Neither my parents, nor the police, nor the city itself knew at that moment that my name would be remembered by an entire nation. And maybe what's most terrifying about my story is that I wasn't chosen for being special. I was taken because I was ordinary, because I was visible and invisible at the same time. While my parents started calling the school, my friends tried to figure out why I didn't show up to class. And neighbors said, she must be running late. Something had already happened to me, and it was far from just being late. The van had no visible license plates. The man wasn't wearing a mask, didn't rush like someone afraid of being seen. It was as if he knew nobody was watching. And nobody was. My kidnapping lasted less than 15 seconds. Enough time to erase a life from the surface without leaving a scream, witness, or trace. What he took was more than my body. It was my entire existence ripped from normalcy. Inside the car, I didn't cry. The shock was paralyzing. The man behind the wheel spoke little, just enough to establish that I had no choice. He said my parents didn't want me anymore, that I should obey or it would get worse. His voice didn't yell, didn't curse. It was calm, and that was even more terrifying. The coldness with which he described my new destiny made it seem like everything had been planned for a long time. That I, a 12-year-old girl, was just another piece fitted into a sick game. We arrived at an ordinary house, surrounded by other ordinary houses, in a neighborhood where nobody would suspect anything. But behind the walls of that place was a hidden basement, protected by a false wall, where time stopped, the air grew heavy, and silence was the only answer to any question. There began what I still didn't know how to name, my season in hell. I didn't scream, not when I was pushed down the stairs, not when the door closed behind me, sealing the entrance to a world nobody should know. I didn't scream because I understood. In that first second, that screaming wouldn't do any good in there. The floor was concrete, the walls damp and cold. There were no windows, no clock, no time. The space was small enough to prevent any escape, but big enough for the silence to become unbearable. I huddled up in a corner, trying to understand where I was. But there were no signs, no logic, just darkness and the rapid breathing I tried to hold in my chest. When the door slammed shut, it left behind an echo of definitive confinement. That's where the rules began. Don't cry, don't ask questions, don't make noise. The man, who still hadn't told me his name, made it clear who was in charge and how I should behave. Fear didn't need to be explained. It was transmitted through his eyes, in the cadence of his words, in the complete absence of any affection. He said my parents had given up on me, that I was there for a reason, that if I obeyed, I would live, and if I defied him, I would disappear. I was only 12 years old, and I believed him. Time became measured by sporadic sounds, the doorknob turning, footsteps coming down the stairs, the clinking of utensils hitting a plastic container with cold food. Sometimes a piece of stale bread, sometimes a bit of pasta that tasted like nothing. Delivered the food with neutral expression, like someone feeding something they haven't decided whether to keep alive. Gradually I stopped trying to count the days. I lost track of mornings and nights. My body ached, but it was my mind that was starting to deteriorate. I would trace words in the air, sing quietly to myself, create stories with invisible characters just so I wouldn't forget I was human. My only company was the sound of my own heartbeat, and the feeling that if I forgot who I was, he would have won. And then, in the middle of that brutal emptiness, came the first sign that I wasn't alone. A faint voice, a whisper from the other side of the wall. Someone, somewhere in that same abyss, was also breathing in the dark. I pressed my ear to the wall, and for the first time since I disappeared, I didn't feel completely invisible. For days, or maybe weeks, the only voice I heard was his, controlling, calculated, always punctuated by orders or lies. But that night, the silence was broken by something different, more fragile, more human. At first I thought I was imagining it. An almost inaudible phrase came through the wall, as if the concrete had breathed. It was a voice, weak, dragged out, but real. I froze. I held my breath and pressed my ear harder against the spot where the sound seemed to come from. "Are you there?" said the voice, low like wounded wind. For a moment I didn't know whether to cry or respond. The loneliness was so dense that hearing another living soul felt like a miracle. The girl's name was Letitia, younger than me, had been there longer. She had also been taken on an ordinary day, had also heard the same lies. The men told her that her parents had disappeared, that now she was part of something bigger, that disobeying was dangerous. And she, like me, believed it. Not out of naivety, but because fear has a power that distorts everything, even logic. We couldn't see each other. We didn't know exactly where we were in relation to one another. But the whispers became routine, a relief, an antidote to despair. We told stories, asked simple questions, made promises we didn't know if we could keep. Do you still remember the sky? Do you think he'll let us go? Do you think anyone is looking for us? Each sentence was like a candle lit inside the endless darkness. The man who kept us captive didn't know that concrete could talk. He separated us with locked doors, alternating routines and forced silence. He thought keeping us in different cells guaranteed control. But what he didn't know was that, deep down, we had discovered something he couldn't lock away. The ability to resist together, even without touching. On one of these days, he forgot to close an internal door. Letitia managed to leave the corner where she was kept. She walked, hesitantly, through a stuffy corridor until she saw me for the first time. Our meeting wasn't loud. There was no scream, just a prolonged look between two devastated girls. Pale, exhausted, thin, but who, upon seeing each other, understood without words. We weren't alone anymore. And that alone was strength enough to keep fighting. Each other's presence didn't free our bodies, but it sustains our minds. And in the middle of the underground hell, where time didn't pass and hope lived hidden, we started counting days, not by the walls, but by the whispers. He wasn't satisfied with controlling my body. He wanted to possess my mind. After weeks in separated cell, the man started doing something new, something sick. He would take Letitia and me upstairs to the house. There the lights were on, the table was set, and the TV was playing. He made us sit, eat with him, smile. He ordered us to say thank you, to call him daddy, to act like we were a family. We obeyed, not by choice, but for survival. Every gesture, every false word was a shield against his unpredictable rage. If we refused, we didn't know what would come next. And he knew that. He knew how to use fear like an invisible leash. He would even ask us to comment on TV shows. He'd say things like, "See, it's better up here. I take care of you. You're mine now." I would respond yes, with a low voice and a churning stomach. Letitia would smile with empty eyes, but inside, we were both screaming. The charade of that environment was worse than the basement. Because in the basement, at least the horror was obvious. Upstairs, he used the most perverse disguise of all, normalcy. He wanted us to forget who we were, for the kidnapper to become protector, for torture to become affection, and for that he uses small daily rituals, meals, games, forced play, as tools for emotional reprogramming, smiling psychoterrorism, brainwashing made of crumbs, occasionally distribute praise, and strategic punishments. But even there, with utensils in our hands and rehearsed words in our mouths, Letitia and I would look at each other in silence. The language between us no longer depended on words. It was made of lingering looks, micro-expressions, squeeze of fingers under the table. Every gesture was a reminder that this was a game, and that the monster might have written the rules, but he hadn't won the match yet. In that fake table, surrounded by walls that hid corpses and memories that still hurt, we knew. We were trapped, yes, but we were still two, and as long as we were two, there was a chance to resist, even if it meant smiling at our tormentor. Over time, I began to realize that the kidnapper's behavior went beyond violence and control. He didn't just keep us captive. He really believed he was doing something right, and that was even more terrifying than any threat. He spoke like someone who believed his own words. He said he had saved me from a worse life, that the world outside was cruel, that my parents had abandoned me, that only there would I be safe. He didn't yell these things. He said them with serenity, like a father explaining why he took his daughter out of school, like someone convinced he was protecting, not imprisoning. This conviction was a dangerous kind of madness, because he didn't see himself as a criminal. He saw himself as a savior, a guide, a caretaker. Some days he would sit on the floor near us and talk about his childhood, about how he had been rejected, betrayed, hurt. He told his stories as if seeking empathy, as if hoping we would understand his motivations, as if that justified everything. I listened in silence, but inside, every sentence was a knife, because I realized, with a clarity that hurt, that this man really thought he was the good guy in the story, that he didn't see the 80 days of captivity as torture, but as care, that in his own eyes, the kidnapping was a rescue. And that made everything more confusing, more dangerous, because a monster who knows he's a monster might have limits, but a monster who thinks he's a saint has none. This role reversal messed with our minds. The line between reality and manipulation began to blur. Was he telling the truth? Were we there for a reason? Had the world outside really forgotten about us? It was at this point that fear stopped being just physical. It became psychological. I began to fight not just against the captivity of my body, but against the prison of my mind. I had to remind myself every day who I was, where I came from, that I was loved, that I didn't belong in that place. And Letitia did the same. And together, in silence, we protected each other from the lie that threatened us most, that this man was our protector. Because when the executioner sees himself as a hero, prison takes on the appearance of refugee. And that's exactly when captivity becomes even harder to break. Letitia and I knew we couldn't trust him, but we also didn't know who else we could trust. The world seemed distant, unreachable, until a small mistake, almost imperceptible, broke the closed cycle of prison for the first time. It was night, one of the many when I was left alone while Letitia was taken upstairs. The ritual always followed the same pattern: locked doors, heavy footsteps on stairs, darkness swallowing everything again. But that night something changed. When the kidnapper came back with Letitia, he didn't notice that a curtain wasn't completely closed. A trivial detail, a minimal crack, but it was enough. From outside, someone saw, a neighbor, a girl's silhouette being led into the house. Quick, silent, strange. It wasn't the first time he thought something was weird there, but until then, it was just a feeling. That night he decided to act. He made a report, and, without knowing, he opened the first crack in the world of silence that the kidnapper had built so carefully. The police were already investigating that man for other reasons: petty crimes, fraud suspicions, questionable activities. Nothing serious enough to raise alarms, but enough to keep eyes open. When the new report came in, adding to the previous ones, it was the trigger needed to authorize a more careful search on the house. Days later, the police arrived. The facade said nothing. A house like any other in the neighborhood. Common doors, normal furniture, but something was wrong. A detail in the house blueprint, reported by a worker who had done renovations there years ago, caught attention. A space that shouldn't exist. A wall that seems to have been built later. They knocked. The sound was hollowed. They forced it, and behind that false wall, they found a door. Thick, locked, but not proof against the truth. When the light from the flashlights invaded the basement, I couldn't believe it. I thought it was another trap, another act. I stayed motionless, looking at the uniforms, the unknown faces, the voices saying my name. I didn't react, I didn't cry. Only when I saw Letitia being pulled from the darkness too, I understood. It was over. It was finally over. Someone had finally come. It wasn't the end of the pain, but it was the end of captivity, and that, by itself, was already a miracle. Outside, the sirens were fading. Inside, light was entering for the first time where there had only been darkness before. But what the police found wasn't just a hidden basement. It was living proof of everything the world had refused to see for far too long. What seemed like just an irregular space at the back of the house revealed a labyrinth of horrors compressed between cement and silence. The false wall hid more than bodies. It kept the blueprint of a prison built meticulously to never be discovered. No windows, no sound, no smell. That man had turned his own house into a capsule of oblivion. And inside it, he caged two lives that the world thought had disappeared. The police officers, even experienced ones, hesitated before entering. The smell was acidic. The humidity soaked through clothes. The walls were covered with scribbles, interrupted sentences, small marks made with fingernails. There were thin mattresses on the floor, empty containers, plastic utensils, food scraps, an environment designed to maintain the bare minimum and deny any dignity. I was sitting in the corner. Letitia, a few feet ahead, huddled as if her body had forgotten how to take up space. Both of us covered by thin blankets, dehydrated, not knowing if we could trust what we were seeing. One of the officers knelt in front of us, slowly removing his cap and said in a low voice, "You're safe now." But safe wasn't a word that made sense yet, because our minds were still locked, frozen, alert. Outside, the news began to spread. All of Belgium stopped. TV showed images of the ordinary house that hid absolute evil. Journalists surrounded the street. The neighbors, incredulous, said that they never imagined something like that could happen so close. But it did happen, and not by chance. It happened because nobody looked carefully, because nobody heard the silences, because evil sometimes chooses the most ordinary disguises. I was taken to an ambulance, covered by a blanket, protected by unknown voices. I finally left a place where time had stopped. While the paramedics took care of me, one thought hammered in my head. But what about the others? Because something told me that that basement didn't just hold the present, it also had traces of much darker past. I was breathing outside air, but my head was still locked inside. On the way to the hospital, wrapped in blankets and surrounded by stranger stares, I could only think of one question, one that nobody seemed ready to answer. The first thing I asked the police wasn't about the kidnapper, not about my parents. I just stared and asked, "Where are the others?" The silence that followed was crueler than any immediate answer. A silence that doesn't come from doubt, but from certainty that hesitates to speak. The answer was in the files, in previous searches, in ignored reports. And more than that, it was buried. Literally. While Letitia and I received medical care, investigators delved deeper into the past of the man who had imprisoned us. They discovered that the house wasn't the only one, that other addresses were connected to him. At one of those properties, under what looked like a dog cemetery, there were two bodies, small, barely identifiable. Julie, Melissa. Names nobody mentioned anymore, but now gained an echo of pain that crossed the country. The two girls had disappeared years before. They were younger than me when they were taken. And unlike me, nobody came in time. They were kept in the same way, fed the same limes, imprisoned in the same basements. But at some point in those parallel stories, they stopped being useful to him. And they vanished from the world. Without noise, without traces, as if they had never existed. I heard their names for the first time sitting in a hospital chair, with tangled hair and still frightened eyes. And, in that instant, I understood that my liberation had come too late for others. That I wasn't an isolated case. I was part of a pattern. A cog in a much larger horror. The pain for them came before joy for myself. Because being alive stopped being relief and became guilt. Why me and not them? The weight of surviving wasn't light. It was dense, bitter, hard to carry. But I would carry it. Because someone needed to remember the forgotten names. Because someone needed to guarantee this would never happen again. And in that moment, I began to understand it wasn't enough to have been saved. I would have to speak. For myself and for all those who were silenced before. The entire country seemed in shock. Photos of the girls filled newspaper stations, interrupt programming, and neighbors tried to disguise their guilt with expressions of amazement. But behind all that noise, there was something crueler. The system that should have protected us had already failed long before. The monster who kept Letitia and me captive already had a name in justice files. And it wasn't new. He had been arrested before, for similar crimes. Abuse, assault, kidnapping. A dirty record, wide open, but never kept him off the street long enough. He was released with benefits, ignored through loopholes, forgotten by decisions that didn't weigh the consequences. And that's why when I asked, why did they let him go free? Nobody had an answer, just bureaucracy and excuses. The population didn't accept the silence. Within days, mourning turned to outrage, and outrage turned to march. Hundreds of thousands of people took the Belgium streets. Dressed in white, they walked silently through Brussels. They didn't shout, they didn't break anything, but each step echoed like a scream stuck in the throat of every parent who could never hug their child again. They called it the White March, not for peace, but for justice. Justice came, but too late for some. And for those who survived like me, it didn't mean immediate relief, because leaving the basement was just the beginning. The real challenge would be living outside with everything that was left inside. I went back home, but the world I found was no longer the same. Neither was I. My body was free, but the echoes of the cell remained inside me. For a long time I avoided speaking. I couldn't, not because I didn't remember, but because remembering hurt as if you were still there. Gradually, I realized that the silence that protected me in captivity was now keeping me trapped on the outside. If I truly wanted to free myself, I would need to speak. I started writing, first for myself, then for the world. When the day came to testify against the kidnapper, I went, trembling, afraid, but I went. And I spoke. He was sentenced to life in prison, but I understood that it wouldn't erase the scars. True liberation came from knowing that my voice had survived. Today, I don't speak just for myself. I speak for Leticia, for Julia, for Melissa, for the children who didn't come back. The girl who was taken on her bicycle came back as a woman the world could never ignore.